After a federal election, millions of dollars of public money is given to political parties to reimburse them for their campaign expenses. This is something called election funding. The total paid after this year's federal election hasn't been finalised, but in 2019, election funding came to almost $70 million. But why are we giving public money to political parties? Don't they fund their campaigns through donations? Well, the answer is yes. And so in this video, I want to run through how election funding works, why we even have it, and whether it makes any sense. Election funding is sometimes also called public funding, but either way, this is how it works. Imagine the 2022 federal election was a lot simpler, and that only 4 parties were involved. When the votes are counted, each party will have a total number of first preference votes. If any party or candidate gets at least 4% of the total votes, then they're eligible for election funding. Once parties are eligible, they get what's called an automatic payment of around $10,000. This is a relatively small amount that's automatically paid no matter how much you've spent on your campaign. But most parties will apply to get much more than this. The maximum a party or candidate can receive is worked out through a quick calculation. The number of first preference votes received is multiplied by the funding rate. The funding rate is a dollar amount per vote. The rate itself is always increasing because it's indexed every 6 months, but at the time of the 2022 federal election, it was about $2.90 per vote. So what this means is that if a party received 100,000 votes, then the maximum election funding amount they can claim would be $291,400. I say that's the maximum because parties need to provide a list of expenses they incurred for their election campaign. As long as you fill out the form and can show there's been expenses, you can claim up to the maximum amount. And what counts as an election expense is pretty broad, so it's easy for parties to submit huge claims. For example, things that are considered election expenses include hiring an election bus, or salaries of staff members, the development of a TV ad even if it's never aired, and rent for office space. All these expenses are submitted to the Australian Electoral Commission, and parties are then reimbursed up to their maximum entitlement. So how much money are parties actually getting? Let's look at the 2019 federal election. The Liberal Party received $27.5 million, with Labor not far behind at $24.6 million. One Nation received $2.8 million, and so on. The other interesting thing to mention is that because the funding is based on first preference votes, you don't actually need to win any seats to get money. You just need to get above the 4% threshold. Which is why, in 2019, the United Australia Party, which didn't win any seats, got over $600,000. And the Fred Nile group, who I didn't even know ran for federal seats, got just over $77,000. So there's a lot of money involved here. What doesn't make sense is how election funding interacts with political donations. Take the 2022 election as an example. The United Australia Party apparently raised donations of almost $100 million, a lot of it from Clive Palmer and his companies. This pool of money was then used to saturate the country with billboards, media ads, text messages, and so on. What seems off about this is that the United Australia Party then made a claim for election funding for almost $2 million, in line with how many first preference votes it had received. It's kind of like double dipping. On one hand, there's little to restrict the amount of donations being received, but then on the other you also get public money in the form of election funding. It makes no sense. To see why election funding was introduced in the first place, and what the justifications were for spending this much public money, we have to go back to the 1980s. In 1983, a parliamentary report on the electoral system recommended that election funding be introduced, and in 1984, it became law. It turns out there were good reasons for having election funding, and at the time it was thought that this would replace political donations. Parties like Labor and the Australian Democrats supported the measure, saying that election funding would remove the necessity or temptation to seek funds and reduce the risk of donations influencing politicians and leading to corruption. It was also argued that election funding would provide more equal funding between parties so they wouldn't massively outspend one another during a campaign. Another argument in favour was that it will mean that parties and candidates won't have to endlessly waste their time fundraising, and instead they'd be able to focus on local and national issues and developing relevant policies. All of this makes a lot of sense. Instead of politicians constantly fundraising and having dinners with donors trying to attract funds, and then being influenced by those donations, they should focus on their jobs. On the other side of the argument though, you had the Liberal Party, who was against election funding and didn't want restrictions on political donations. They were saying that public money should be spent on other, more important things. The Nationals were also against election funding. Interestingly, they were arguing that there was little evidence that the dependence on private donations leads to undue influence on candidates. Fast forward a few decades, and in 2011, a parliamentary committee again reviewed how election funding and political donations interacted. The report they published was pretty interesting. It said that the rising cost of election campaigns was a matter of concern, and that to have a fighting chance, you would in most cases need to spend lots of money. This is sometimes called a campaigning arms race. The problem is that the introduction of election funding in the 80s didn't do what it was intended to. It didn't reduce the reliance on donations, it didn't reduce the risk of corruption, and it didn't stop the need for constant fundraising. Instead, it just became another stream of income for political parties. And that's because donation laws have remained too loose. To give you an idea of what's happened in other countries, Canada adopted what was essentially a full public funding model in 2004. Corporate donations were banned and individual donations were capped. There were also caps on how much could be spent on a campaign. That was until 2015, when the Conservative government got rid of public funding. This kind of full public funding model is something the Greens have supported in Australia. It's clear that the system we have now isn't working. Massive amounts of public money is given out to parties and candidates after every election. And these same parties still get huge amounts of political donations. It should be one or the other, not both. Otherwise, you're not getting any of the intended benefits. But on that note, I'm keen to hear what system you think we should have, so leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. If you want to help me make more content, please consider checking out my Patreon page, links in the description.